the Beard and Mustache Competition Death, a Velvet Clues mystery narrated by Connor. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unravel in the most unexpected places. I'm Connor, and tonight I'm honoured to share with you a most peculiar case observed through the keen eyes of Miss Marple. This is the story of ambition, hidden resentments, and one fateful afternoon at the annual Grand Beard and Mustache Championship. But before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever watched a competition turn sinister? A place where pride and passion hide something darker? Do share your thoughts in the comments below. Now settle in with your favourite drink, and let us journey together into this curious mystery. Chapter 1. The Championship Ground and Curious Beginnings. The Metropolitan Convention Centre hummed with an energy that Miss Jane Marple found both fascinating and slightly bewildering. She had been persuaded to attend the annual Grand Beard and Mustache Championship by her niece, who had insisted that the event represented a unique study in human nature and competitive spirit. Miss Marple, accustomed to observing village life with meticulous attention, found that such advice applied equally well to the microcosm of any gathering, no matter how specialized its nature. The convention hall had been transformed into a temple of hirsute glory, with elaborate staging areas where competitors prepared their facial hair with the dedication of artists perfecting masterpieces. Enormous mirrors lined the walls, and each competitor's station was equipped with an impressive array of grooming products, oils, balms, and conditioning treatments. The air carried the mingled scents of sandalwood, bergamot, and something indefinably sophisticated that Miss Marple recognized as the expensive aftershave of ambitious men. She observed with mild interest how the competitors moved about with a particular sort of pride, stroking their beards with the careful attention one might bestow upon a prized possession. Many had travelled considerable distances for this event, and several had maintained their facial hair for years, even decades, in pursuit of championship recognition. One gentleman in particular caught her attention, a man of perhaps 60 years with a magnificent grey beard that extended nearly to his waist, intricately braided and adorned with what appeared to be silver clasps. His name, she learned, was Victorian Ashford, a previous champion of some renown who had held the title for a decade before his retirement from competition. The day's events were to culminate in the finals at precisely 3 o'clock, where the judges would make their determinations regarding overall beard and moustache achievement. Miss Marple had secured a position near the judging area where she could observe the proceedings with comfort and clarity. Beside her sat her acquaintance from the village, Mrs. Catherine Wells, who had proven instrumental in acquiring their attendance at this most unusual gathering. The morning proceeded with various preliminary competitions, each segment celebrating different categories of facial hair artistry. There were competitions for beard length, moustache magnificence, grooming technique, and overall presentation. As noon approached, Miss Marple began to note certain irregularities in the competitors' behaviour that struck her as worthy of closer attention. Several contestants appeared distressed, examining their facial hair with growing alarm. She observed one young man frantically consulting with the event organisers, gesturing toward his previously impressive moustache, which now appeared thin and depleted, sections of hair conspicuously absent. Another competitor seemed on the verge of tears, his elaborate beard showing similar signs of systematic damage, as though something had been applied to it overnight to weaken and remove portions of the growth. Miss Marple leaned toward Mrs. Wells and inquired with characteristic gentleness whether the lady had observed these curious developments. Mrs. Wells, who had been absorbed in the visual spectacle of the competition, looked momentarily puzzled before confirming that she had indeed noticed what appeared to be some distress among several participants. It was at this juncture that a man approached the judging area, bearing the harried expression of someone responsible for managing a situation that had begun to slip beyond his control. He was introduced as Mr. Harrison, the competition's chief organizer, and his demeanor suggested that something had occurred that extended beyond the normal scope of event management. After conferring briefly with the judges, Mr. Harrison announced an unexpected development. Several competitors, he explained, had reported that their grooming supplies had been tampered with, that substances had been added to their products during the previous evening, when security had been momentarily reduced for maintenance. purposes. The specific products appeared to be depilatory agents, commercial hair removal preparations that had been introduced into what should have been legitimate grooming balms and conditioning treatments. The implications of this revelation settled over the convention hall like a pall. Here was evidence of deliberate sabotage, a calculated attempt to compromise the preparation and appearance of fellow competitors. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intellectual curiosity that always accompanied situations in which human nature revealed its capacity for calculated malice. The competition's integrity, Mr. Harrison continued, now hung in considerable question. The judges were conferring regarding whether the event should proceed, or whether disqualifications should be implemented for those whose preparation had been compromised. The mood among the competitors had shifted dramatically from celebration to suspicion, each man viewing his neighbours with newfound wariness. It was then that a most unexpected announcement came through the convention hall's public address system. One of the final competitors, a relatively young man named Roland Markham, who had been positioned to compete in the championship round, was being rushed to the medical facility within the convention centre. He appeared to have suffered an acute allergic reaction and was experiencing severe respiratory distress. The announcement created immediate confusion and concern. Medical personnel were summoned, and a general commotion ensued as event organisers attempted to manage both the emergency situation and the growing concern among the assembled competitors and spectators. Miss Marple observed that several individuals moved toward the competition area with particular urgency, their faces registering various degrees of alarm or concern. As the medical team worked to stabilise Mr. Markham's condition, Miss Marple found herself reviewing the morning's peculiar developments with the methodical precision she habitually applied to complex situations. The deliberate sabotage of competitors' facial hair, now compounded by an unexplained allergic reaction affecting one of the final competitors, suggested circumstances that extended well beyond the simple realm of competitive mischief. Chapter 2. When Breath Becomes Dangerous. The medical facility within the convention centre proved to be a reasonably equipped emergency area, though clearly designed for the management of minor incidents rather than acute medical emergencies. Miss Marple had followed the crowd of concerned competitors and spectators who had surged toward the treatment room in a collective wave of anxiety and curiosity. Roland Markham lay upon a medical bed, his breathing laboured and accompanied by an ominous wheezing that suggested serious compromise of his respiratory passages. The medical attendant on duty, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, was working with evident urgency to stabilise the patient's condition, though her expression registered increasing concern. It became apparent almost immediately that Mr. Markham was experiencing anaphylaxis, an acute allergic reaction of the severe variety. His face had begun to swell, and his breathing had become progressively more difficult despite Dr. Chen's immediate interventions. The doctor was attempting to access the medical supplies that should have contained an emergency epinephrine injection, the standard treatment for such acute reactions. Dr. Chen's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she reached for what should have been Mr. Markham's emergency medication, an EpiPen that the patient himself had identified as being in his personal medical kit stored at the medical facility's entrance. However, when the injection was administered, the effect proved distressingly inadequate. Roland's breathing did not improve. His condition appeared, if anything, to worsen as the minutes passed. Dr. Chen, now operating with evident alarm, attempted a second injection from her own medical supplies. This proved more effective, and within moments Roland's breathing began to stabilize, his facial swelling gradually subsiding as the proper medication took effect. Miss Marple, observing these proceedings from a position of careful distance, found herself troubled by several circumstances that seemed to require explanation. The first injection, administered from Mr. Markham's own emergency medication, had proven entirely ineffective, a situation that seemed to warrant investigation. As Roland's condition stabilized and he was transported to the local hospital for further observation and treatment, Dr. Chen remained in the medical facility, her initial professional composure beginning to give way to evident concern. She was examining the EpiPen that had proven ineffective, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she studied the device. Miss Marple approached the doctor with characteristic courtesy and asked whether the lady might benefit from a moment's conversation regarding what had just occurred. Dr. Chen, clearly shaken by the experience, welcomed the opportunity to discuss her concerns with someone who appeared sensible and genuinely interested in understanding what had transpired. The EpiPen, Dr. Chen explained, should have contained epinephrine, the medication essential for treating acute allergic reactions. However, her examination suggested that the device might have been compromised. The medication within appeared to be clear and colourless, as it should be, but her professional experience suggested that something was amiss with its chemical composition or potency. Miss Marple listened to this account with careful attention, mentally cataloguing the various elements that seemed to suggest deliberate intervention in Mr. Markham's medical preparations. First, the systematic sabotage of multiple competitors' grooming supplies with depilatory agents. Second, the apparent compromise of Mr. Markham's emergency medication. These circumstances, taken together, seem to suggest something considerably more sinister than simple competitive mischief. She inquired gently whether Dr. Chen had observed Mr. Markham receiving any grooming products during the morning's proceedings, or whether he had applied any new preparations to his facial hair. The doctor, somewhat surprised by this question, confirmed that she had indeed observed Roland applying what appeared to be a conditioning treatment to his beard approximately 30 minutes before the onset of his symptoms. Miss Marple felt her suspicions crystallizing into something approaching certainty. The sabotage grooming products, she hypothesized, might not have been intended merely to damage competitors' facial hair. Instead, they might have been designed to introduce a substance to which Mr. Markham possessed an allergic sensitivity. The depilatory agents, she reasoned, might have served as a delivery system for an allergen designed to trigger precisely the sort of reaction that had nearly claimed his life. Chapter 3. Secrets concealed behind championship pride. As the convention center gradually returned to something approaching normal operations, with officials implementing enhanced security measures and investigating the breach that had allowed the tampering with competitors' supplies, Miss Marple found herself engaged in what had become her characteristic pursuit of understanding the human motivations that lay beneath the surface of apparently simple circumstances. She positioned herself in the competition's administrative office, where officials were attempting to process the considerable disruption caused by the day's events. With characteristic diplomacy, she inquired whether she might be permitted to observe the official competitor registration documents and information, suggesting that such records might provide valuable insight into the various competitors' backgrounds and potential motivations. Mr. Harrison, grateful for what he perceived as genuine interest and concern from a distinguished elderly lady, readily granted her access to the materials she requested. What Miss Marple discovered proved most illuminating indeed. Among the competitors listed for the championship round was an individual named Victor Ashford, the gentleman with the magnificent grey beard, whom she had observed earlier in the day. According to the competition records, Victor had been champion for 10 consecutive years, an unprecedented achievement in the competition's history. However, his reign had ended 3 years previous, when a scandal involving alleged misconduct had forced his retirement from competitive participation. More intriguing still was the notation regarding his comeback attempt at this year's championship. Victor had registered to compete again, his comeback beard carefully maintained and prepared for re-entry into the competitive arena. However, additional documentation suggested that his return had been marked by considerable controversy among other competitors, several of whom had objected to his reinstatement based on what they characterized as his questionable conduct during his previous tenure. Miss Marple inquired of Mr. Harrison regarding the precise nature of the scandal that had precipitated Victor's retirement. The organizer, somewhat reluctant to discuss what he clearly perceived as an unfortunate chapter in the competition's history, eventually explained that Victor had been accused of employing unfair practices during his championship years. Specifically, he was alleged to have sabotaged competitors' preparations through the introduction of damaging substances into their grooming supplies, a practice that had ultimately resulted in his forced retirement when the scheme was discovered. The irony of this revelation was not lost upon Miss Marple. Here was a man who had been removed from competition for engaging in precisely the sort of behavior that was now being perpetrated upon other competitors at the current championship. She inquired further regarding the circumstances of Victor's retirement and whether any particular competitor had been instrumental in bringing about his downfall. After consulting with other officials, Mr. Harrison provided the answer. The competitor who had exposed Victor's misconduct was a man named James Richardson, a talented and principled individual who had been Victor's primary rival during the champion's reign. James had ultimately succeeded Victor as champion, though he had eventually retired from the competition to pursue other interests. However, Mr. Harrison added with evident surprise, James Richardson was among the competitors registered for this year's championship. His beard, carefully maintained throughout his retirement, had been prepared for his own comeback attempt. Miss Marple felt the pieces of this complex situation beginning to align themselves into a coherent pattern. Here was a situation in which grievances, resentments, and calculated revenge might well have provided powerful motivations for the various deceptions and sabotage that had characterized the day's proceedings. She requested permission to speak with several of the competitors, beginning with Victor Ashford. The gentleman, when located, initially demonstrated considerable reluctance to engage in conversation, but the courteous and non-threatening manner in which Miss Marple approached him gradually persuaded him to discuss the morning's events. Victor confirmed that he had indeed been subjected to the sabotage that had compromised several competitors' preparations. Depilatory agents had been introduced into his conditioning balms, resulting in visible damage to his carefully maintained beard. His voice, when he discussed this matter, carried unmistakable bitterness and resentment. However, he denied any involvement in the sabotage affecting other competitors, particularly regarding the apparent tampering with Roland Markham's emergency medication. Miss Marple observed carefully as he made these denials, noting the subtle shifts in his expression and demeanour that suggested he was not being entirely forthcoming regarding all aspects of his knowledge concerning the day's events. She then sought out James Richardson, the previous champion, whose investigation had led to Victor's earlier downfall. James proved to be a more candid conversationalist, though he displayed his own evidence of emotional conflict regarding the day's circumstances. James acknowledged that he had been aware of Victor's return to competition and had harboured considerable doubt regarding the propriety of allowing a competitor with such a tainted history to participate in the championship. He confirmed that he had recommended Victor's exclusion at administrative meetings held in advance of the competition, though his recommendations had been overruled by the competition's governing body, which had determined that sufficient time had passed for Victor to be permitted to attempt rehabilitation of his reputation. Miss Marple inquired whether James harboured particular animosity toward any specific competitor currently participating in the championship. She observed James's reaction carefully as she posed this question, noting how his jaw tightened briefly before he responded. After a moment of hesitation, James revealed that he had become aware of suspicious circumstances regarding Roland Markham's recent competitive practices. Specifically, James claimed that Roland had been employing techniques remarkably similar to those that Victor had been discovered using years previous. Roland, James suggested, had been introducing depilatory agents into competitors' grooming supplies with the apparent intention of compromising their preparation and appearance. However, James continued, there was something more troubling still. He had discovered that Roland possessed a personal history that connected him to Victor Ashford. Roland's father, years previous, had been a promising competitor whose beard had been deliberately destroyed through Victor's sabotage. The destruction of the father's carefully maintained facial hair had caused him such psychological distress that he had withdrawn from competition entirely and had never grown his beard again. Miss Marple felt the complex web of motivations and grievances crystallizing into something approaching comprehension. Here was a situation in which multiple layers of revenge and retaliation had apparently intersected at a singular point in time, creating circumstances in which seemingly simple competitive mischief masked considerably darker intentions and conflicts. Chapter 4. The Medication's Silent Replacement. As Miss Marple continued her investigations into the circumstances surrounding Roland Markham's allergic reaction and the apparent tampering with his emergency medication, she found herself pursuing a line of inquiry that led her to examine the precise sequence of events that had characterized the morning's proceedings. She requested permission to speak with the medical facility's staff, beginning with Dr. Sarah Chen. In a private conversation conducted away from the bustle of the convention centre's main areas, Miss Marple inquired, regarding the precise timing of when she had last confirmed the contents and condition of the facility's medical supplies. Dr. Chen confirmed that she conducted standard inventory checks at the beginning of each day. The EpiPen that had proved ineffective when administered to Roland had been confirmed as present and apparently intact during that morning's inventory. However, she acknowledged that the device had not been physically examined with the sort of detailed scrutiny that would have revealed tampering until the moment of crisis, when its inadequate effectiveness had prompted closer inspection. Miss Marple then inquired whether anyone with medical knowledge or access to pharmaceutical supplies might have been present in the medical facility during the morning hours. Dr. Chen provided the names of several individuals who had legitimate reasons for being in the facility, including nursing staff, maintenance personnel, and representatives from the competition's administrative office. However, one name in particular caught Miss Marple's attention. Dr. Michael Thornton, the competition's official medical advisor, had been present in the facility early in the morning, ostensibly to conduct his own preliminary review of medical preparations and emergency supplies. According to Dr. Chen, Dr. Thornton had specifically examined the EpiPen that had been designated as Roland's emergency medication, commenting that he wished to verify that it had been stored properly and maintained at appropriate temperatures. Miss Marple requested permission to speak with Dr. Thornton when she located him. She found a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, whose bearing suggested professional competence and considerable self-possession. However, beneath this veneer of professional composure, she detected what she believed to be evidence of significant emotional tension and conflict. When she inquired regarding his morning examination of Roland's EpiPen, Dr. Thornton initially seemed inclined to dismiss the matter as routine professional protocol. However, when Miss Marple pressed gently with additional questions, his composure began to display evidence of strain. Eventually, Dr. Thornton revealed a most remarkable circumstance. He had been aware that Roland Markham's emergency medication had been systematically tampering with throughout the morning. Moreover, he had deliberately abstained from reporting this knowledge to relevant authorities, apparently motivated by considerations that extended beyond simple professional duty. Miss Marple listened to this extraordinary admission with careful attention. When she inquired regarding Dr. Thornton's reasons for engaging in such negligent behavior, he provided an explanation that revealed yet another layer of complexity in the web of grievances and motivations that characterized this situation. Dr. Thornton had, years previous, possessed a daughter of considerable promise whose competitive beard, meticulously maintained for over a decade, had been deliberately destroyed through Victor Ashford's sabotage. The destruction of this beard, which had represented years of careful cultivation and dedication, had caused his daughter such profound psychological distress that she had withdrawn from competition entirely and had subsequently experienced significant depression and emotional difficulties. Dr. Thornton, motivated by a desire for justice for his daughter's suffering, had apparently regarded Roland Markham as a continuation of the victimization that had begun with Victor's earlier misconduct. Roland, as Victor's apparent heir and successor in employing sabotage techniques, had seemingly represented an appropriate target for Dr. Thornton's desire for retaliation and revenge. However, Miss Marple observed, Dr. Thornton had apparently not anticipated the severity of the allergic reaction that had resulted from the introduction of the allergen into Roland's grooming products. His intention, she hypothesized, had apparently been to cause discomfort and competitive disadvantage, not to place Roland's life in genuine jeopardy. Dr. Thornton, confronted with this analysis, reluctantly acknowledged that Miss Marple's assessment appeared to capture his motivations with uncomfortable accuracy. He had intended to compromise Roland's preparation for the championship, not to precipitate a genuine medical emergency that had nearly claimed the competitor's life. Miss Marple reflected that she now possessed a reasonably complete understanding of the motivations that had driven at least some of the day's events. However, several aspects of the situation remained troublingly unclear, and she sensed that the full truth regarding the tampering with Roland's emergency medication lay deeper still within the complex web of grievances and conflicts that characterized this unusual gathering. Chapter 5. A Beard's Decade of Dominion. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Roland Markham's near-fatal allergic reaction had, by necessity, begun to focus increasingly upon the historical context that had given rise to the various grievances and motivations animating the current situation. Miss Marple, recognizing that understanding the present required comprehension of the past, set about interviewing various individuals who had been participants in the competitive beard and mustache community during Victor Ashford's decade of championship dominance. What emerged from these conversations was a portrait of a man whose competitive drive had apparently expressed itself through calculated sabotage and deliberate undermining of rivals. Victor's championship years had been marked by an unusual pattern in which numerous competitors had experienced mysterious damage to their carefully maintained facial hair, often occurring on the eve of important competitive events. At the time, these incidents had been regarded as unfortunate coincidences or results of competitive zeal that had occasionally overstepped the bounds of proper conduct. However, as the incidents accumulated and patterns became apparent, suspicion had gradually focused upon Victor himself as the likely perpetrator of these systematic attacks upon rivals' preparation. The breaking point had come during Victor's final championship year, when James Richardson, then a rising competitive figure, had conducted a careful investigation into the origins of several sabotage incidents. James's research had eventually led to the discovery that Victor had been systematically introducing depilatory agents into competitors' grooming supplies, accessing their preparation areas through his position as a competition official. When confronted with this evidence, Victor had initially denied any involvement. However, as the proof had mounted, he had eventually been forced to acknowledge his misconduct. The competition's governing body had determined that Victor's actions constituted a fundamental violation of competitive ethics and had stripped him of his championship title and banned him from further participation. However, it emerged that Victor's actions had caused considerable psychological and emotional damage to numerous competitors. One victim in particular had suffered consequences so severe that they had effectively ended his competitive career entirely. This individual, identified as Marcus Richardson, had been James's father. Marcus had been a highly talented competitor whose beard, carefully maintained for a remarkable 10 years, had represented a lifetime of dedication and competitive achievement. Victor, apparently viewing Marcus as a serious threat to his own competitive dominance, had sabotaged Marcus's grooming supplies with particular viciousness, introducing depilatory agents specifically designed to cause maximum damage to the older competitor's pride and joy. The destruction of Marcus's carefully maintained beard had devastated him psychologically. He had withdrawn from competition entirely and had never grown his beard again, regarding the experience as too painful to endure a repetition of the trauma and loss that he had suffered at Victor's hands. Miss Marple reflected that this historical context provided crucial insight into the current situation. James Richardson, motivated by his father's suffering and his own experience of observing Victor's misconduct firsthand, had apparently been determined to prevent a repetition of such victimization in the current championship competition. Roland Markham, as it emerged through further investigation, was revealed to be Victor's nephew, raised by his uncle and apparently groomed to continue Victor's competitive practices and philosophy. Roland had apparently inherited his uncle's disregard for ethical competitive conduct and had been employing similar sabotage techniques against his rivals, apparently seeking to replicate his uncle's championship success through similar methods of undermining competitors. The sabotage that had occurred at the current championship appeared to have been initiated by Roland himself, who had introduced depilatory agents into multiple competitors' grooming supplies. His intention, it seemed, had been to compromise their preparation and ensure his own advancement to the championship finals. However, Miss Marple reflected, the situation had grown considerably more complex when the tampering with Roland's own emergency medication had occurred. Someone, motivated by grievance or revenge, or perhaps by a desire to prevent Roland from achieving the sort of competitive success that his uncle had enjoyed through unethical means, had apparently replaced the contents of Roland's EpiPen with an ineffective substitute. The question that now required resolution was precisely who had engaged in this particular act of sabotage, and what motivations had driven them to take such a dangerous step. Chapter 6. The Championship Judge's Curious Knowledge. As Miss Marple's investigation continued, she found herself drawn to an examination of the various officials and judges who presided over the championship competition. One particular judge, a gentleman named Mr. Leonard Prescott, struck her as worthy of closer attention. Mr. Prescott was a distinguished figure in the competitive beard and moustache community, a former champion himself, and someone whose judgment and opinion carried considerable weight with the competitive fraternity. He had served as one of the primary judges for the current championship competition and had been present throughout the morning's proceedings. When Miss Marple approached Mr. Prescott with a request for conversation regarding the day's events, she found him initially resistant to extended discussion. However, her characteristic courtesy and the obvious sincerity of her interest in understanding what had occurred gradually persuaded him to engage in dialogue. Miss Marple inquired whether Mr. Prescott had possessed advanced knowledge regarding the possibility of sabotage or tampering with competitors' materials. The judge's reaction to this question was immediate and highly revealing. His expression shifted from composed professional demeanor to something approaching alarm and defensiveness. After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Prescott reluctantly acknowledged that he had indeed been aware of certain suspicious circumstances that suggested the possibility of deliberate interference with competitors' preparations. However, he had chosen to refrain from reporting his suspicions to the competition authorities, apparently motivated by considerations that extended beyond simple professional responsibility. When pressed to explain his reasoning, Mr. Prescott revealed a personal connection to the situation that significantly illuminated his apparent inaction. Years previous, during Victor Ashford's championship dominance, Mr. Prescott himself had been a competitor of considerable promise. Victor had sabotaged his preparation in a particularly vicious manner, introducing depilatory agents specifically designed to cause permanent damage to the gentleman's beard. The damage had proved so severe that Mr. Prescott's beard had never fully recovered its former magnificence. This circumstance had effectively ended his competitive aspirations and had driven him to abandon his pursuit of championship recognition, instead channeling his expertise and passion into the role of judge and administrator. Mr. Prescott had apparently harbored significant resentment toward Victor for years following this incident. When he became aware that Roland, Victor's nephew, was apparently engaging in similar sabotage techniques, and particularly when he learned that Roland's intended victim was to include some of the competitors whose suffering reminded him of his own experience, Mr. Prescott had been moved to action. However, Miss Marple observed, Mr. Prescott's action had apparently taken a form that stopped short of direct intervention. Instead, he had apparently revealed knowledge of Roland's sabotage practices to certain other individuals who might be motivated to take action on their own initiative. Miss Marple inquired delicately whether Mr. Prescott had shared knowledge regarding Roland's tampering with his emergency medication. When Mr. Prescott confirmed that he had indeed provided such information to at least one individual who possessed both medical knowledge and personal motivation to prevent Roland from achieving competitive success, the judge acknowledged that his actions might have indirectly contributed to the circumstances that had nearly claimed Roland's life. Chapter 7. Victor's Confession and Hidden Motivations. The investigation had now reached a juncture at which Miss Marple felt compelled to conduct a final, definitive conversation with Victor Ashford regarding his knowledge of and potential involvement in the tampering with Roland's emergency medication. When she approached Victor with this intention, she found him in a state of considerable emotional agitation. His magnificent beard, the symbol of his competitive pride and years of careful maintenance, seemed to have lost some of its luster, and the gentleman himself appeared diminished in bearing and composure. Victor, when confronted with Miss Marple's carefully articulated questions regarding his knowledge of Roland's activities and his possible involvement in the tampering with his nephew's emergency medication, eventually broke down and provided a confession that revealed unexpected depths of complexity and regret. Victor acknowledged that he had been aware of Roland's intention to employ sabotage techniques similar to those that Victor himself had employed years previous during his own championship years. Moreover, he had initially encouraged Roland in this direction, apparently motivated by a desire to pass on his legacy of competitive ruthlessness to the next generation of competitors. However, as the morning's events had unfolded, and Victor had witnessed the systematic sabotage that Roland had perpetrated upon other competitors, something had shifted in his perspective. Victor had begun to experience what appeared to be genuine remorse regarding his own past conduct and the consequences that it had caused for numerous competitors whose careers had been damaged or ended by his interference. This emerging sense of regret and conscience had apparently motivated Victor to take action to prevent Roland from achieving the sort of success that Victor himself had enjoyed through unethical means. Victor, in what he characterized as an attempt to protect Roland from repeating Victor's own mistakes, had apparently tampered with his nephew's emergency medication with the intention of causing Roland's disqualification from the championship through competitive disadvantage. However, Victor acknowledged with evident distress he had apparently not fully appreciated the severity of the allergic reaction that would result from combining the allergen introduced through the tampered grooming products with the ineffective medication. His intention, he insisted, had been to prevent Roland's success through competition, not to place his nephew's life in genuine jeopardy. Miss Marple listened to this account with careful attention. While Victor's explanation seemed plausible in certain respects, she sensed that the matter still retained elements of complexity that had not yet been fully resolved. Chapter 8. The Medical Advisor's Final Reckoning. Following Victor's confession and the revelation that he had apparently been responsible for the tamper with Roland's emergency medication, the investigation seemed to have reached a point of approximate resolution. However, Miss Marple's instincts suggested that certain elements of the situation still required clarification. She returned to her conversation with Dr. Michael Thornton, the competition's official medical advisor, and presented him with the information that had emerged regarding Victor's involvement in tampering with Roland's EpiPen. She inquired whether Dr. Thornton's earlier statements regarding his own knowledge of the tampering remained accurate in light of this new revelation. Dr. Thornton, confronted with this direct questioning and the implications of what had emerged from Victor's confession, eventually acknowledged that his earlier account had been incomplete. While he had indeed been aware that Roland's emergency medication had been compromised, and while he had indeed chosen to remain silent regarding this knowledge, he had not been the individual responsible for the actual tampering itself. However, Dr. Thornton continued, he had shared knowledge regarding the compromised medication with Victor Ashford, apparently motivated by a desire to ensure that Victor would have the opportunity to prevent Roland from engaging in further sabotage of other competitors. Dr. Thornton had apparently believed that sharing this information with Victor would lead to some form of intervention that would prevent Roland from continuing his unethical conduct without actually placing the young man's life in genuine danger. Dr. Thornton acknowledged that his judgment in this matter had been profoundly flawed, and that his actions, though motivated by what he believed to be honourable intentions, had contributed to circumstances that had nearly claimed Roland's life. The revelation had apparently sobered him considerably regarding the consequences that could result from attempts to manipulate situations and events through the provision of incomplete or strategically selected information. Chapter 9. The Competition's Shadow Ethics. As the full scope of the sabotage, tampering, and various acts of calculated interference had been revealed and documented, Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the broader implications of what had occurred at the championship competition. The incident appeared to reveal something troubling regarding the way in which competitive passion could become corrupted by desire for revenge and the determination to visit upon others the consequences of past injuries and affronts. The investigation had uncovered multiple layers of deliberate interference and calculated misconduct. Roland had sabotaged competitors' grooming supplies, apparently continuing the legacy of sabotage that his uncle Victor had established years previous. Victor, motivated by emerging regret regarding his past conduct and by a desire to prevent Roland from repeating his mistakes, had tampered with his nephew's emergency medication. Dr. Thornton, motivated by grievance regarding past victimization and the damage that Victor's conduct had caused to his daughter, had chosen to remain silent regarding the tampering with Roland's medication, apparently believing that allowing Roland to face the consequences of his own conduct would constitute appropriate justice. James Richardson, the previous champion whose investigation had led to Victor's downfall years previous, had apparently provided information to Dr. Thornton regarding Roland's sabotage practices, apparently motivated by a desire to prevent a repetition of the victimization that had characterized Victor's championship years. Judge Leonard Prescott had similarly shared information regarding Rowland's conduct with individuals who might be motivated to take action, apparently motivated by both his own past suffering at Victor's hands and his desire to prevent future competitors from experiencing similar victimization. Each individual involved in the situation appeared to have engaged in some form of deliberate interference or calculated action, each motivated by what they believed to be honorable intentions, yet each contributing to a complex web of deception, sabotage, and interference that had nearly resulted in the death of a competitor. Chapter 10. The Resolution and Reflections upon Competitive Conduct. In the aftermath of the investigation's resolution, local authorities conducted their own inquiries and determined the appropriate allocation of responsibility for various acts of sabotage and interference. Rowland Markham, recovered from his acute allergic reaction and now subject to official investigation, acknowledged that he had indeed been responsible for introducing depilatory agents into multiple competitors' grooming supplies. Victor Ashford, confronted with evidence regarding his tampering with Rowland's emergency medication, ultimately acknowledged responsibility for that particular act. He was subsequently subject to formal prosecution for what authorities characterized as conduct substantially similar to that for which he had been banned from competition years previous. Dr. Michael Thornton, while not directly responsible for the tampering itself, was investigated regarding his apparent knowledge of the compromised medication and his choice to remain silent. Authorities ultimately concluded that his conduct, while ethically questionable, did not rise to the level warranting formal prosecution. Judge Leonard Prescott was similarly investigated regarding his apparent provision of information to individuals who might be motivated to interfere with Rowland's competitive success. Authorities concluded that while his conduct was ethically problematic, it similarly did not warrant formal prosecution. James Richardson was cleared of any direct involvement in the tampering or sabotage, though authorities noted that he had apparently provided information to Dr. Thornton regarding Rowland's conduct with the apparent intention of facilitating some form of intervention. Rowland Markham ultimately recovered fully from his allergic reaction and was released from the hospital. He was subsequently disqualified from the championship competition due to his admitted responsibility for the sabotage of competitors' grooming supplies. He subsequently faced prosecution for his conduct and was subject to legal consequences for his actions. In the final hours before departing the convention centre, Miss Marple found herself engaged in conversation with Mrs. Catherine Wells, her companion throughout the championship events. She reflected upon the troubling circumstances that the investigation had revealed. The incident, she observed, appeared to demonstrate something profoundly unfortunate regarding the manner in which competitive passion could become corrupted by desire for justice and revenge. Multiple individuals, each believing themselves to be acting from honourable motivations, had engaged in deliberate deception and interference. Victor Ashford, motivated by emerging regret regarding his past conduct, had tampered with his nephew's emergency medication in what he believed to be an attempt to prevent Rowland from continuing to engage in the same unethical practices that had damaged Victor's own reputation. Dr. Thornton, motivated by grievance regarding the damage that Victor's conduct had caused to his daughter, had remained silent regarding the compromised medication, apparently believing that this silence would serve a form of justice. Judge Prescott and James Richardson had similarly engaged in information sharing that, while perhaps motivated by desire to prevent future victimization, had contributed to a web of deception and manipulation. Each individual had apparently believed that their particular form of interference represented a justified response to past injuries or a necessary prevention of future harm, yet the cumulative effect of their various actions had been to create circumstances in which an innocent competitor had nearly lost his life. Miss Marple suggested that the incident provided troubling evidence that simple questions of right and wrong could become dangerously obscured when individuals believed themselves to be pursuing justice or preventing harm. The path from honourable intention to dangerous action could prove remarkably brief. Mrs. Wells, absorbing this philosophical reflection, remarked that it seemed that the competition had ultimately been won by something other than the quality of the competitor's facial hair. Miss Marple, adjusting her hat and preparing for departure, agreed that this appeared to be an accurate assessment indeed. The Metropolitan Convention Centre gradually returned to ordinary operations. The championship competition was ultimately rescheduled for later in the year, when the various legal proceedings and investigations could be completed and a degree of stability restored to the event's reputation and conduct. Roland Markham, once recovered from his ordeal and having completed his legal obligations regarding his conduct, eventually withdrew from competitive participation entirely, apparently deciding that the emotional and personal costs of continued involvement in the competitive beard and moustache community exceeded whatever rewards such participation might provide. Victor Ashford was convicted of tampering with Roland's emergency medication and sentenced to a period of probation and community service, a consequence that he appeared to accept with something approaching resignation. He subsequently retired permanently from the competitive arena and began to engage in what appeared to be genuine efforts at personal redemption and reconciliation with the various competitors whose careers had been damaged by his past conduct. James Richardson ultimately won the rescheduled championship competition, his comeback beard proving sufficiently magnificent to impress the judges, despite the various controversies and emotional upheaval that had characterized the competition. However, he announced following his victory that he would retire permanently from competitive participation, apparently deciding that the achievement of his comeback victory provided a satisfying conclusion to his involvement in the sport. Judge Leonard Prescott continued in his role as official judge, but underwent significant professional training regarding ethical conduct and appropriate boundaries for official involvement in competitive matters. He similarly began efforts at personal reconciliation with his own past experiences of sabotage and victimization. Dr. Michael Thornton continued in his role as the competition's official medical advisor, but similarly underwent professional and ethical training regarding appropriate conduct and reporting obligations when aware of potential safety threats. As Miss Marple reflected upon these developments during her journey homeward with Mrs. Catherine Wells, she was moved to consider how profoundly human nature's desire for justice and revenge could cloud judgment and motivation. The incident at the championship had ostensibly been about competitive excellence and the proper recognition of achievement in the cultivation and maintenance of impressive facial hair. However, beneath this superficial focus, the true contest had been one between various individuals' conflicting desires for justice, revenge, redemption, and prevention of future harm. Each participant in this hidden contest had apparently believed that their particular form of interference was justified by their motivation and the righteousness of their cause. Yet the practical consequence of their various actions had been to create circumstances of genuine danger and to undermine the very principles of competitive integrity that they believed themselves to be defending. The beard and moustache competition, rather than becoming a celebration of the devoted cultivation of facial hair, had instead become a stage for the playing out of complex psychological dramas rooted in past injuries and conflicting desires for justice. Miss Marple observed that such situations were by no means unique to the unusual world of competitive beard and moustache appreciation. Similar dynamics of hidden motivation and concealed conflict, she reflected, likely played out in seemingly ordinary circumstances throughout villages and communities everywhere. The particular genius of human nature appeared to lie in its capacity for justifying nearly any form of interference or misconduct by appealing to higher motivations and righteous causes. As the vehicle carrying Miss Marple and Mrs. Wells departed from the convention centre and returned toward their ordinary village life, Connor's narration completed its account of this most unusual and troubling matter. The beard and moustache competition had ultimately revealed less about the proper cultivation of impressive facial hair, and considerably more about the complex and often troubling patterns of motivation that characterized human competitive endeavor, revenge, and the pursuit of what individuals believed themselves to be justice.